Hello and welcome to our latest Energy Magazine exclusive author interview. I'm Catherine Krupka, your host today for what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation with Dr. Helané Wahbeh. Dr. Wahbeh is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and an adjunct assistant professor at the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. She's clinically trained as a naturopathic physician and research trained as a master in clinical research with 2 postdoctoral research fellowships. She's published and spoken internationally and is especially known for her research around and noetic approach to channeling. Indeed, she's authored a book called The Science of Channeling: Why You Should Trust Your Intuition and Embrace the Force That Connects Us All. The title alone gives us lots to talk about, right? I am so excited, Dr. Wahbeh. It's really an honor to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So let's start just diving right in with what actually is channeling. It's a term we hear a lot, but we'd benefit obviously from your elucidation and from the differentiation for channeling with mediumship or psychic abilities or just plain intuition.
So I describe channeling in kind of a unique way, which is really a broad umbrella term that encompasses a wide variety of phenomenon. And so the official definition from my perspective is that it is the experience of accessing information and energy from beyond our conventional notions of time and space that can appear receptive and expressive. And so that's quite a mouthful, right? So envision that these channeling experiences exist on a spectrum. On one side, you might have things like intuition or gut hunches that just about everybody would say that they've had some intuitive hit that turned out to be true. And then on the other side, you might have more rare experiences like mental mediumship or what I call trance channeling, which some people, when they hear channeling, they think of what I'm calling trance channeling, where the channeler believes that their body is used as a vehicle for a non-physical being to speak through them. So that's what I call trance channeling. It's a little bit more rare, and it's a subcategory of this broader channeling umbrella. And each one of us, I propose, has an innate ability to channel, and that the way that it shows up for us is unique to us. We have our own specific expression of what that looks like. And also, in terms of this receptive versus expressive piece, there's some of these channeling phenomenon where it feels receptive in that I'm receiving information from beyond my 5 senses. Let's say of my relative who lives halfway across the country, I might receive some mental impression about what's happening for them in that moment. Or channeling can also appear expressive, like where my consciousness or my intention is affecting the physical world. Like we see all these studies around healing where people's positive intention can positively impact cells, plants, animals, humans. They can actually create a small, but we've seen relatively consistent effect in healing outcomes. So that's a nice long answer about what I call channeling. So it really is this broad, encompassing definition that around our inner wisdom, our intuition, and all the various ways that that shows up.
So that's actually it's a fascinating definition. And I love the distinction between the receptive and the expressive. And I know, our Energy Magazine audience are largely people in the healing arts. And so most of us have probably had possibly an experience of both, either coming through us or receiving. And so to hear that channeling does really encompass all of that, and that it's both the intuitive hit we get and the healing effect we may have when working with someone, or simply, I don't know, I think also when you hug a family member when they're down and they can feel better, that even that may be a form of channeling. We're bringing through that universal love, perhaps. um I'd love to ask, I heard you say anyone has the capacity to do this. So talk to us a little bit about how channeling might show up differently for different people, that anyone can do it. And I'd love if you'd go into a little bit, because channeling can be a word people can just be a little nervous about using. There can be some, taboos or some fears around it. So kind of talk to us about, how does one engage in this? How does it show up differently for different people? And how do we get comfortable with this idea?
That's a great question. And there's a lot to unpack there for sure. And so first I want to just acknowledge the taboos around this topic. And, historically, people who have expressed these capacities have been burned at the stake. So we have in our historical background very real examples for why we might have fear about these experiences being out in the open. So I just really want to acknowledge that. And to also say that, our dominant scientific paradigm right now about how the world works is a materialist, physicalist one, right? So these intuitions that we feel, or the energy that we feel as we're doing a healing session, don't quite fit into that worldview. And so there's also taboos that we face around that. But the reality is that there is increasing evidence that these phenomenon are valid, that we can test them in the laboratory, we see them spontaneously. And so, one of the main motivations for me for writing my book is to really just bust open those taboos so that we could start having transparent conversations about this. And so one of the limitations, I think, in having those conversations are the various terms. And so, I use this term channeling. You can also call it intuition. You can also call it noetic wisdom. You can call it extrasensory perception or psychic. There was a whole book, 300-page book written of just the terms that have been applied to these phenomenon. So a bit of a morass as you start diving into it. And what I think why this is so is because a lot of these experiences are really ineffable. They are hard to describe with words. And so here we are with our human mind and our vocabulary attempting to define things that are very challenging to define with words. So I think that's another acknowledgement about how we kind of engage in this conversation. And so we've been working on this exact thing through a program called the Noetic Signature Program. So I mentioned this piece about how our channeling abilities, the way they show up for us, are really unique to us. So the way my channeling looks is different than how your channeling looks. And I think it sounds like such a simple thing, but it's a bit revolutionary to talk about it in this way. And so this program that we've coined another term, of course, called the Noetic Signature. And this was partly to highlight the individual aspect of our channeling expression, and to also get away from the taboos around the word channeling, because people hear noetic signature and they're like, oh, that's interesting. What's that all about? So noetic comes from the Greek meaning gnosis or inner wisdom, and the signature refers to the unique aspect of it. So we've done numerous studies around this now and have developed an inventory that people can take to see what their noetic signature is. And we have found that most people's noetic signatures load onto 12 different characteristics. And I won't go through all 12 of them, but just to give you a little taste of it, some people really experience their intuition in their bodies. They might get goosebumps, or they might feel sensations in their gut, like either an expansion or a contraction, or they might just feel that something is true, right? So there's people who are kinesthetic, if you will. It's a little bit like the learning piece. Some people are very visual and they get imagery, and that's how their intuition shows up for them. Other people are auditory and they hear things. And then there's another characteristic that's really relevant to your audience, which was around healing and using intention to manifest healing, whether it was in another person or within themselves. And this healing characteristic was a subcategory of this intention's effect on the physical world, that our consciousness, our intention can actually affect our physical world. And what does that look like? And this, positive intent piece is really, I think, pivotal in that. So I'm not remembering all the other aspects of your question, but about the innateness in everybody. So, this is really my proposal, and we're kind of holding that at IONS. And there has been some interesting studies that we've done that is actually supporting that. So in one study, we took 14 high functioning psychics. So these were people who jumped through many hoops at our lab to show that they actually could demonstrate this skill. And they had to have family history of similar experiences in their family members. And then we got people who did very poorly on all our tasks and didn't have any family history, which are actually very, very difficult to find. And we looked at their genetics, and we found this interesting difference in the non-coding region of chromosome 7 that was in the wild type, or the original form, in the psychics, and was in a mutated form in the people who were non-psychic, so the control people. And so that was really fascinating to us. So that means that the psychics had the original gene, and something had pushed it away from having those psychic abilities. And so when we looked at that part of the genome in this huge global data set, over 90% of humanity in this data set had this original, let's just call it for ease, psychic original form of the gene.
Wow.
Incredible. And then we thought, okay, what pressures would force people to not want to have that, right? And so we looked at the spread of Christianity, and if that was related to the expression of this, and it was true. So there were more mutations in the more strongly Christian populations.
Fascinating.
I know. And then we also looked at technology, because if you think about these skills evolutionarily, if you can tune in and know where the buffalo are, you're going to have a higher survival rate, right? If you can use these, beyond five senses intuitions to guide you. And so we also looked at the relationship of technology development and these mutations. And again, we saw a relationship there as well. So to me, this is really fascinating, compelling information around that perhaps humanity's kind of natural original state is to have these psychic, channeling, ESP, whatever you want to call it, abilities. And different pressures have kind of moved us away from that. So that's really fascinating. And then we did another study where we recruited people to come to the laboratory. Some of them were mediums, self-identified as practicing mediums. And mediums, the way I'm kind of thinking about it is that they believe that they can communicate with people who have died. So we had mediums. We also had people with no self-claimed mediumship abilities. And we had them do this task in the laboratory where they saw a picture of a face and they had to choose how this person is deceased. They had to choose how this person died. And they had 4 choices, like accident, heart attack. I don't remember the 2 other choices, but they were different enough. And so we had everybody take this task, and we had hypothesized that the mediums would do above chance in terms of their guesses, and that they would do better than the controls. Well, what we found was that everybody did above chance, that the mediums didn't actually do better than the controls, that these people who said, I don't have any mediumship ability, were actually able to guess how this person died above chance. So we're getting ready to, so that again supports this idea that everybody has this at some level. And we're getting ready to do another follow-up study to that, where we'll have 300 people take the task, and they will also have a EEG brainwave collecting headband on, so that we'll be able to see what's going on in their brain when they're making these choices, and if their brainwaves look different when they choose correctly versus incorrectly. So I invite your audience to stay tuned and check out our website, because if you want to, you could participate in that really fun study.
Oh my goodness. We could talk all day just about just about what you've shared so far. It's fascinating to me, first of all, when you talk about, the very individual expression of these, of this energy, of this communication. I don't want to, um, and the sort of ineffable nature of it, how challenging it must be to research it. I mean, it's not, like a piece of technology where you could, or something, or like in principle, a medication where you're looking for a specifically reproducible, that very linear left brain kind of scientific method, right, to produce the exact same result every single time. And here we're working with something that shows up differently for different people, expresses differently through them, has a different effect on one person and another. And so, I'd love to ask you about how one even does that research, but I think that's probably not where we want to probably not where we want to go with this. But I really am fascinated by this, and so impressed. And I've followed ions for years. The work that you are doing and the work that that ions is doing in this area. I'd love to ask um, about your book, right? In which there's also a great deal, obviously, of research. And so, why did you write The Science of Channeling, and what do you really hope that people will get from it?
Prime motivator for me in writing the book was for people to not feel alone, because when I first started working at IONS and started talking about the IONS channeling research program, it was when we were doing talks in person, and I would have a line of questions afterwards, and people would come up real close to me and they'd say, thank you so much. I've had this experience myself, but I've never been able to talk to anybody about it. And, I'd thank them and answer their question. And then the next person would come up and they'd get really close and they'd say, thank you so much. I've had this experience too, but I've never been able to talk to anybody about it. And that happened over and over and over again. And I'd get emails and I was like, why aren't people talking about this? And I started probing and identified the taboos and why there were these taboos, and realized that, people didn't really know about the research that has already been done on this for over 150 years. In fact, I personally did not know about it at all until I started at Ions. I had my own personal channeling experiences when I was a very young child, but I definitely kept that hidden in the closet. And it was only when I started at Ions that I learned about parapsychology, and that in the West, these phenomenon have been studied since the 1800s. We have thousands and thousands of papers and books and experiments that have been actually looking at these phenomenon. But because of the taboos, they've been completely sidelined, shoved under the rug, and not been explored as fully as they could be. So I wanted to create a book that was for the general public, that was incredibly accessible for people, for them to be able to hold up and say, look, I'm not alone. These experiences are completely common. In fact, we've done tons of research on it, and here's what we know. There's a lot more research we need to do, but here's where we're at today. And let's talk about it. Let's have transparent conversations about it. And for the, one of the main purposes for these open conversations is, how do we use it to support us? Because we need all the help we can get right now, as on individual level, but so humanity is just in big trouble. And I feel that tapping into these accessible sources of incredible wisdom will really be able to help us to navigate these incredibly challenging times. Just to give you a simple example,
Please.
many people today are just completely overwhelmed with decision making because we are just bombarded by information. I mean, the information age is such an incredible gift and blessing, and it's so completely overwhelming. And so, I don't know how many people I've talked to that just become paralyzed in decision making about their own lives because they just, oh, I have to look at this and I have to look at this. And there's just all this deluge of information coming in. And yet, that's a very cognitive process. How do we actually take the time to go internally and tap into our own inner wisdom? And that doesn't mean to get rid of the facts and the figures and the information from outside you, but to, while taking that into account, also go within and say, okay, well, what is in my highest and best right now for my next step? And for me personally, and for so many people that I've talked to, that is the greatest personal gift of channeling beyond all others, is decision making and living your life in an easeful, effortless, with high quality of life, just dramatically improves when you tap into your own intuitive gifts.
So I see a benefit of the book really being starting some of these conversations. So hopefully everybody reads it and it gets spread widely, and we can all start talking about this and sharing these experiences. And I also hear you saying that the book has some ideas about how we can start tuning in, how we get more comfortable, how we build these muscles, if you will, to be able to use this for to guide our lives at this very, very dicey time.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about your own experience. I know, ions and all of that, but you mentioned that you had uh, your own experiences growing up channeling. And so I'd love to hear, tell us about your experience. How did you get into all of this in the first place?
Yes. I was a very, very sensitive child growing up, emotionally sensitive. If I came into a room, I could feel people's emotions and the energy. And, as a young child, I didn't have the language to know exactly what was going on, and couldn't really explain it. I was really afraid of the dark, and We had these stairs in my house that had you have to go up 7 and there was a landing and then you'd go up the next 7. And I'd always feel like, something was behind me as I turned that corner to go up to the next flight. And in hindsight, I look back and it's like, I was just so incredibly sensitive to beyond the physical and didn't know how to process that. So when I was 10 years old, my mother actually brought me to my grandparents' house where there was a spiritualist type seance happening, and they called them meetings. So there were about 40 people in the room sitting in a circle, and my uncle was a trance channeler, and he was sitting there trance channeling. My grandmother is a trance channeler. My mother is a trance channeler, and I've since learned how to do that as well. And so, from my perspective as a young child, they weren't charging any money. There was absolutely no motivation for them to try to con people. I knew my uncle and grandmother incredibly well, and, they were talking and saying things that wouldn't come from their normal ego selves, so to me it was felt very legitimate. It's like, okay, we have this relationship with the spirit world, and how do we connect and engage and set intentions to be supported by, protected, connect with, to get information, etc. So that was the worldview that I was raised with, that I am more than this physical body, that I have a spirit soul that continues beyond my physical death, that there is a whole realm of non-physical beings that exist beyond what we can see with our 3D eyes, and that they can support us and nurture us in our lives. And so that was, kind of my hidden belief system that I was raised with. And, I also went to Catholic school. I went to Greek, Orthodox Christian church every Sunday. And I had a very eclectic spiritual upbringing. And so that was supported by my own experiences of channeling. I, get goosebumps when I hear a truth. So I'm very, very kinesthetic. I would get downloads, like when I was working with patients, when I was in private practice, I would just get completely formed information about my patient that I couldn't possibly know, that they didn't share in their history. And I would, ask a question, and then that would be the key that would unlock them for either catharsis or to gain information that would really help them with their symptoms and whatever they were dealing with. When I started at IONS, I learned about a protocol to actually learn how to trance channel. And because I experienced it in my family, and I was actually doing studies on it at that time, I wanted to learn how to do it. So that was about 4 years ago now. And so I was successfully able to learn how to do that through hypnosis. And if I choose to, I can get into that state. So that's a little bit about kind of my personal experience. And I use it daily for my own decision making, for my own guidance on my own path. And even in our work, our science team starts each meeting with a meditation or some other noetic practice, and we support each other to really tap into our intuitive wisdom. And, the next people that people often ask me is, well, how can we really know where this information is coming from? Is it really, these spirits or beings or whatever? And, if I put my scientist hat on, I will say, we do not have definitive proof one way or the other. And in fact, I don't think we have the tools to be able to definitively show. And even the whole word prove, I don't think we can really prove anything. There is definitely growing evidence and a very large body of evidence demonstrating that our consciousness survives physical death. And if your audience is interested in that, you can check out the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies contest that they did a few years ago. And all the award-winning essays just have compiled all that evidence in a really concise and accessible way. But so yes, my scientist hat says we can't definitively prove. My personal belief, just as Helané, is that yes, there are multiple dimensions beyond our own, and there are non-physical beings that we can interact with. And then beyond both of those separate hats is this idea that, if we are all interconnected, if the fundamental nature of reality is that we are all one, then it ultimately doesn't matter what we name this source of wisdom, because it's all still an aspect of ourselves. And until we have the tools to definitively show what the source is, I invite people to not get hung up on what the source is, but to be incredibly discerning about the content. So, if you're getting information that's very, oh, you need to make money, or, oh, you need to hurt this person, or, oh, like sort of negative connotation, it's likely not coming from a higher self. It's likely coming from your ego, personality, layered self. And so it really is about tapping into the content beyond our personal mind and discerning if that is useful to you and can support you in your daily life in a positive way.
That's a very, very valuable point about that discernment, right? And how ways we can kind of filter, is this really something useful, clear, probably accurate, or is this something my mind is making up? Or in shamanic traditions and some others that I'm aware of, they're the higher worlds or the lower worlds, and information can come in different ways or from different sources. And so to be discerning the same way we would as you and I are talking now. We want to be discerning about what information we're taking in.
Absolutely. Yes, some people will project their authority onto channeled content. They'll say, oh, it's channeled, so it must be true. And I do not advise that or support that at all. And that doesn't mean that it's not true either. It's just, you just take everything at face value and explore for yourself. And it may be that channeled content is actually not true for you, but it's true for the person sitting next to you. Because the messages coming in have different purposes, if you will. And so I invite people when they're exploring this, and it's so simple to explore it. Literally, you just can take a few minutes a day to sit quietly with intention. If sitting doesn't work for you, go walk outside, but just bring that intentful awareness to first acknowledge that you have access to this bigger information, if you will, and that to acknowledge that you are fully capable of accessing it yourself. And then, just spend a few minutes listening. You can start with simple questions, ideally yes, no questions to start. You ask a question and then you tune into what you're feeling, what you're seeing, what you're hearing. Just be really open and curious about how that information comes to you, because everybody gets it in different ways. And so please don't start with, should I leave my husband, or should I go move to Alaska and salmon fish for the summer? Like, start with very simple choices, decisions that you're curious about, and then you follow through. And if it is aligned with your highest and best, it is going to feel easeful. It's going to bring more joy. you'll see more synchronicities showing up in your life. That is the best way to really discern if the information you're getting is from this higher guided source or if it is your ego self. If you find yourself banging your head against the wall, following your channeling advice, it's probably from your ego mind rather than a higher source, because the higher source guidance will create more ease, flow, openness, positivity, and synchronicities.
So that's a really valuable point, right? As we're tuning into that and as we're living from it, then our experience of life changes and kind of becomes its own reinforcement, its own validation, if you will. Yes? Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. The other point around that to mention is that it's, especially when people are first starting out, immediate choices are easier to tune into than choices in the future. So, like, what should I do today? What should I do tomorrow? Those are much easier to feel into than, okay, in 5 years, am I going to be living at this place? There's a lot that can happen. And my personal sense is that, you know, the future is not set in stone. It's more of a probabilistic manifestation. And, you know, people get upset. They say, oh, I went to this psychic and they said, you know, in 5 years, I'm going to publish this, you know, best-selling book, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, well, just them telling you that completely changed all the choices that you made. And so the future shifts based on what you're choosing in your life, based on that information.
Very, very important to keep in mind. You know, it's funny, one of my early teachers would talk about starting with picking what I was going to wear in the morning, right? Like, what, you know, what color feels right today, or what, you know, or
Yes.
picking like a menu, picking an item on a menu or something, right? Simple things where we could sort of tune into the feeling, tune into the knowing, or something popping off the page, right? Sort of testing each of
Yes.
the different, or some of the different anyway, channels through which they come. That's really, really wise for you to share that with us. And I really appreciate you sharing that. I really want to talk a little about your research with ions. But before we do that, I want to actually ask a question about your Energy Magazine article, your most recent one. And you talked about research about these non-physical helpers, right? And that just seems extraordinary and fabulous and really relevant for our audience, many of whom, as I've said, are in the healing arts. And most of us have experienced something like this, right? We, you know, someone can feel a being over here, or we hear the name or what have you. And so I'd love for you to share just a little bit. I know in the article also, just in case you haven't read her article yet, you also share some of the steps we can use to really get in touch with this and work with it. But I'd love to ask you to share a little bit about what you discovered in your research about the reality of this.
Thank you. Yes, as far as I know, these two studies are the only ones that have actually been formally done on this topic. And so in the first study, we had 200, about 200 energy medicine sessions. And we had one clairvoyant seer observing those sessions, because we had so many different measures we were collecting to try to figure out how energy medicine works. And so this was another way for us to try to do that. Could she see the energy? Was it moving in certain ways? Was it going from the healer to the healy, etc.? So we had so many notes, it was pretty overwhelming, but we got all of those transcribed. And what we started seeing was that she kept mentioning these non-physical beings. It was less, I mean, there was information about colors and energy movement, etc., but there was all this other information about, you know, the energy medicine's spirit guide showed up, and, you know, the participant spirit guide was helping move the energy. And all these interesting things. So that was really quite fascinating. That led us to do another study, because one of the major criticisms was, oh, that's just one person who was observing the sessions. So we did another study specifically with Reiki masters, and we had 6 of these clairvoyant seers observing each session. And then we looked at the corroboration across what they were observing. And we looked at that in 2 different ways, a quantitative way and a qualitative way. The quantitative way we didn't see as much corroboration as we wanted to, but there were definitely some clear themes that were common across the seers. And one of those themes was this non-physical being presence. And so we decided to do a separate study looking at all of that data and evaluating that specific piece about the non-physical beings. And we're writing that up right now. Every single one of those 40 sessions had a non-physical being mentioned. For the most part, the beings were helping in some way. They were either supporting the Reiki master, supporting the participant, holding space, moving with the energies, etc., assisting in some way. But there was also a lot of mention of non-physical beings that were harming or were part of the pathology. So this whole idea in shamanism and other indigenous cultures of spirit attachments, or earthbound spirits who don't move on after they pass, and they kind of stay stuck in the field of the participant, creating pathology. So that was also really quite fascinating to see that. So we're excited to put this work out into the world, again, just like my book, to just at least bust through the taboos and say, hey, we've no clue if this is real or not, and we can't prove if there's spirits really there. We don't have the technology to film them or whatever, but people's felt subjective experience is that this is actually happening. And so how do we categorize that, characterize it, start having dialogue about it, and exploring it in a formal way? Because if it really is somehow involved in the healing process, isn't it our responsibility to actually explore that? Because if we aren't then tapping into it, then maybe that's not making our work as effective. And if we actually set intentions and did, then it potentially could. And I'll just end that answer with the acknowledgement that this is a very Western problem. Because most cultures, besides Western cultures, are completely, they're like, we don't know what your issue is. Of course, spirits.
Of course, these are here. Of course.
Yes, of course, they're part of the healing process. And that's how we heal, as we engage with the spirit world and our interaction with them. So I just want to acknowledge the kind of very limited view that Western cultures hold, that this feels foreign or new or different, when, probably the majority of humans
It's human history.
are part of how things work.
Yeah. So it is interesting. One of the things I wonder about is we have, so much of the world where this is a given. Of course, these things occur. Of course, there are, non-physical beings among us. Of course, we can communicate with the non-seen. Of course, this is completely normal. It's a very, like you were saying, it's a minority of the world that even feels we have to have a conversation about this, that it isn't just what we do all day, every day. And it is kind of funny to think about the lengths that we go to conduct this, scientific, quote unquote, which of course is also a concept we made up, right? It isn't like inherently the way to do something. It's just a way that we created not that long ago, actually, right? And trying to apply it to this realm that it just doesn't feel like a natural fit, right? And yet you're doing it, and I'm blown away the more I learn about your research. And this is a great segue to ask a little bit about ions, in case any of our audience doesn't already know ions and the amazing work that they're doing. We want to be sure everybody knows and can follow, and your work as research director there.
Thank you so much. Yes, IONS has a wonderful history. It was founded 50 years ago now, which is amazing, by Edgar Mitchell, who is an Apollo 14 astronaut and the sixth person to walk on the moon. And he did his job on the moon, and he was coming home, and he was in his capsule turning around, seeing the stars and the moon and the sun. And he just went completely dissolved and went into this transcendent state where he was part of everything and everything was part of him. So as this astronaut engineer, this was completely foreign to him, and he was blown out of the water and came back to Earth and the States and was like, okay, I'm starting the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or IONS, to be able to delve into what this interconnectedness is. And so that's been done for the past 5 decades mostly through experience, education, more recently with our science department. And so we really promote this idea of a noetic handshake between science and direct experience, that when you have both, nurturing each other is when the greatest transformation can happen. And so our guiding hypothesis is that we are all interconnected, and that embodying that awareness allows us to access this information and energy from beyond time and space, or this channeling state, which in turn can profoundly amplify transformation, innovation, and well-being. So we have active 21 studies right now, and we have an incredibly rich array of community resources, from blogs. All of our research papers are available online. We have free online programming called Connect Ions Live. There's just so many ways to connect and engage in this conversation, including our annual online conference is happening at the end of May. So that's available. It's a virtual conference, so it's available to anyone around the world. And we would invite you to plug in whatever way works for you to join our community, to engage in these conversations.
Wow. I would love to talk to you all day. I have 100 questions, and I really want to encourage folks to read your Energy Magazine article, to pick up your book, The Science of Channeling, because and to start the conversation. I mean, all of us here are in this already, and I'm sure nothing that we're talking about is a shock to anybody who's listening. But isn't it beautiful, and isn't it validating, and isn't it exciting to realize that there's research being done in language, a common language now, that we can use to begin sharing this among one another, with our clients, with families, with whomever. I mean, I know I see among my clients people who come and will sort of say something like what you were hearing on your speaking tours, like, I can't tell anybody else this, but, and I imagine, I mean, the number of people who are having these experiences but whispering them to somebody instead of just saying, like, yes, of course, here we are, is probably mind-boggling. I mean, it's probably billions of people uh, who are having these experiences and not feeling like we can talk about it, I suppose.
Yes. So let's all come out of the channeling closet
I
and
love it.
supporting each other to nurture, explore, use these gifts to really support ourselves. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to share about this work. And I'm really excited that this audience is interested, and happy to share more as you plug into our IONS community.
Thank you so much. It is truly an honor and a complete joy. And thank you very much for being with our Energy Magazine audience today.
Thank you.